Here in an episode of Chordplay, and this is I Love 60s Chords. And if you've been following my channel, if you go back far enough, you'll find that 70s chord, 2 episodes of I Love 80s Chords. I think I put together one, I Love 90s Chords episode. And I thought I'd go ahead and hit the 60s because we haven't gone here yet. And really I've focused a lot on 70s and 80s guitarists. There's some 90s and some more recent guitarists too. But there's something really beneficial about going back in time and studying music, from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And I've had students over the years, that would come in, for private lessons, and they'd sit down and admit, I like really old music. I listen to a lot of 80s or a lot of 90s. And I always look at them and I say, well, don't worry about that. That's not really that old. I've worked on music from the 1600s, and their eyes usually bug out and then they realize, okay, the 70s or the 80s, even though that was a little while ago, it really, in the grand scheme of things, really wasn't that long ago. If you're looking at, centuries of music or whatever. When you look at the decade of the 60s, there was a lot of, things changing in society and a lot of things changing with music too, right along with all the political and society, events that were happening. Civil rights and all these things that were erupting, in the 60s, and the music really did kind of morph and change, because earlier in the 60s you had a lot of kind of folk rock and acoustic, and there was a lot of kind of layover from music, in the 50s, kind of extending into the 60s. But it's really interesting that Buddy Holly, passed away and died, tragically in, February of 1959, and that was kind of right before, 1960, obviously. And then at the end of the decade, once you kind of moved into 1970, Hendrix passed away and died tragically in September of 1970. So it's really interesting that 2 giant, heroes of electric guitar, Buddy Holly and Jimi Hendrix, they passed away basically, right before the beginning of the 60s. And then, like I said, Hendrix passed away at the end, moving into 1970. So that's really interesting, and that kind of does show the span. You start with Buddy Holly and you kind of end it with Hendrix and Cream and some of those groups, and it's really interesting to tap into that and notice all those changes and mutations and variations of rock music. Depending on your interests and musical, preferences and taste, you can find all kinds of stuff. There's the folky acoustic stuff, there's the more kind of rock blues, and there's tons of great artists, from England during the 60s, the whole British invasion, the Beatles, of course. You got the Stones, you've got Cream, you've got a lot of the, kind of British influence. And then eventually it started to kind of turn psychedelic, and the Beatles and Hendrix and everybody really started to get trippy and kind of different. So depending on what you prefer, acoustic guitars, electric guitars, psychedelic rock, or whatever, the 60s really does deliver this variety of all these different sounds and influences. So here we go. All right, with the opening, that was Oh Well from Fleetwood Mac, and that's Peter Green on guitar, and that's back when Fleetwood Mac was seriously rocking. I mean, not that they stopped rocking after Peter Green, but it definitely changed, the band. They turned more into like a melodic pop group. But the early days with that rootsy, blues rock sound, it's irresistible. It's great. But oh well, something like this. powerful, grabs your attention right off the bat. It technically does start on acoustic guitar, and then the electric guitar, you know, kind of doubles it. But you've got this kind of E5 based riff right here. Flirting with this E power chord, and then you're grabbing, you know, the notes from that riff and the single note part right there. So it's a really easy riff. You can really just play it with 2 fingers, but it's rocking. You know, you don't really need this fancy, crazy, you know, guitar part. That riff alone is killer. And then you start sliding into this E with the low E open, and then you're grabbing like part of an E minor chord right there. And then you've got this riff. Doing this, and then you've got this little sneaky riff, and the timing there is really weird too, real quirky, and then that starts the verse right there. But that song totally rocks. Right up next is Oh Well Part 2 from Fleetwood Mac, and this is a noticeable shift from Part 1, because Part 1's rocking out and kind of blues influenced. Part 2 almost sounds like a spaghetti western or something. Sounds like Clint Eastwood should be, you know, walking around. But we've got this. You know, something like that. And it keeps kind of cycling through chords, but we've got this E minor right here, you know, kind of a reverse fingering, you know, think of a D power chord, but flip it, and then you've got all the open strings right there. And then you're kind of moving up to this, and you could think of that as D over F sharp, or even like a little piece of B minor 7 over F sharp. Either way, you're hearing that E minor, you know, kind of answered with this chord. And you probably, you know, the easiest way to think of that is just D over F sharp right there. Back to this, and that's basically B minor over D right here. So think of, I mean, it kind of reminds me of a couple chord shapes, you know, flipped upside down. It almost feels like A minor, but you're backwards, you know, and on a different set of strings, of course, too. But that's a cool way to play B minor right there. And then you hear it kind of just cycle back and forth between those chords again. That part of the song, it's this intimate, kind of quiet, almost like a western kind of moment, like I said. Really cool. Up next is Jimi Hendrix, and this is an obscure Hendrix song, but it's The Stars That Play with Laughing Sam's Dice, which was actually a B-side from the single of Burning the Midnight Lamp, and then I think it didn't actually appear on an album until Smash Hits. So it is a very obscure Hendrix song, and there's a killer cover of this by Randy Hansen on YouTube. Check it out. But this is a riff from that song, and it's actually flirting with some Hendrixisms, you know, during this riff. And I chose this just because it's kind of obscure, and it's, you know, digging a little bit deeper than, say, like Purple Haze or whatever. But this, it's this. Really cool, kind of funky, you know, kind of slow grind. But we're doing this E minor 7 right here in the beginning. So it might look like E7 sharp 9, but you're not actually playing the third right there, that G sharp. You're just really playing the root, the flat 7, and the minor third right there, that G. And then you're walking down, kind of flirting with D7, just a little piece. You're playing the root, the third, back to the root, and then the root to the flat 7 right there, that C note. And then it pops to A7 right there. A little bit of vibrato on that chord, and then you're flirting with C7 back here. So it's this clunky, kind of bashed, you know, chord riff, but really cool. Check that song out, it's really cool. Next up is Cream, and this is SWLABR, which stands for She Walks Like Bearded Rainbows or something like that. Really odd, but cool riff, you know, from Clapton, based around some basic chords, and then there's this really sneaky chord hiding during the verse. Really cool. Something like this. Busy little active riff, kind of funky because you're kind of scratching in there a little bit, but you're really just moving from E to G to A back to G, and then you're doing, you know, E to D back to E. And then during the verse you hear that E, and then you hear this kind of weird kind of rubbing chord right there. And you could think of that a ton of different ways. You could base that around A, you could base it around E, but you do hear like the low E, the A, the open D, and the G string there. So if you relate that to E, that's kind of like an E13. E13, what, sus4, I guess? And then that A to G again. That kind of dissonant chord right there. Really cool. Next is the obscure 13th Floor Elevators, which are widely known as the psychedelic rock kings, even though they kind of are an obscure group. But this is Roky Erickson on guitar, and this is Kingdom of Heaven. And it's a really interesting, you know, just this kind of tense sound, but you hear this. That gave a lot of fans either the chills or nightmares or something, because you have E minor and then you're kind of rolling back or picking backward, but then you're grabbing the flat 5 right there, that B flat, while you're still letting some of the open strings ring right there. And I just like that kind of suspenseful, you know, out of nowhere flat 5. Like, you know, F major to E minor back and forth. But if you want to dive a little deeper in psychedelic rock, check out 13th Floor Elevators. They're kind of underappreciated, and they do have a cult following that's very loyal. And you know, if you talk to enough people that are a little older, they'll fill you in. I mean, they're a great psychedelic rock band, even though most people don't even know who they are. Next is the Mighty Beatles, and this is I Want You, She's So Heavy from Abbey Road. You know, one of my favorite Beatles songs. I love when the Beatles became psychedelic and kind of experimental. You know, I mean, their bubblegum kind of early pop, you know, pop rock was okay. But when they kind of let their hair grow and they got kind of weird, I really dug, you know, that era, experimentation. But the chords here are really interesting. This is all, I think it's from John Lennon. But we've got this. Just that kind of intro. And then of course it moves into the verse, and it almost turns into a blues tune for a minute there. But with that intro part, those chords are awesome. There's D minor, and then D minor over F, and then E7 flat 9, and then you're kind of walking down to this B flat 7. And the last chord there, you could think of that as either like an A flat 13 or A augmented, like that. You could think of that as either, a flat 6 or flat 13, or also the raised fifth. But that intro part. The song has been definitely under the microscope in recent years with all the allegations towards Stairway to Heaven and the similarities between Taurus and Stairway to Heaven. And as you kind of notice this guitar part, you're going to see, kind of a similarity, but it's very different, in my personal opinion. Of course, I'm a huge, Zeppelin fan, so I'm not trying to defend Led Zeppelin. I'm just being honest. Like, it's noticeably very different than Stairway to Heaven, even though you do have the descending, kind of minor bass line there, but it's noticeably, very different than Stairway, like this. Something like that. And then of course it moves into a different section. But if you're familiar with Stairway to Heaven, which I'm guessing most of you watching this are probably very familiar with that song, it is slightly different. It starts with this A minor add 9, and then you're doing an A minor major, A minor major 9, and then it's just basically A minor 9, and then right there it's an A minor 6 9. So you're really just descending. You're really just descending along the D string. And then that's changing and affecting those chords, or implied chords. And then this is really unusual. So that's an F major 7 sharp 11. And then you hear the A kind of introduced there, added, and then that's going to change that to an F sharp 11. And then this is kind of an implied D13. And then you hear it kind of slide back into that A and it starts all over again. Continues from there. That's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with I Love 60s Chords. And you may be wondering why I'm using the guitar, on my left leg. I'm just changing things up, and I do this from time to time just to kind of break me out of my comfort zone, because that's one thing I think everybody watching this should do. Yeah, it's great to have a comfort zone and like your favorite guitar and your favorite amp or your favorite pedals or whatever, and you get lost in this comfortable world. But it is a good idea occasionally just to shake things up and, plug into a different amp, use a different guitar, maybe even put your guitar on a different leg, just to kind of challenge yourself, or just to kind of, like I said, break you out of your comfort zone. So, definitely, classical guitarists kind of use their left leg like this, but I'm pretty random, so I don't like locking into just this kind of stagnant, thing. I like to shake it up and mix it up and challenge myself and try different things. And that's a big reason why I chose this episode today, because the 60s are interesting. It's a very liberating, time in society, but also a liberating time in music too, because all these kind of restraints and traditions and all these things, they just flew right out the window when you get to the 60s. And people were experimenting, with different tones, and lots of pedals were introduced, fuzz and wah and all these different things. So it really did shake things up. And if you compare the 60s to the 50s, even though the 50s are really cool, there's some great music in the 50s. I love that, that era. But it is noticeably different. The 50s were kind of glossier and a little safer, and the 60s were kind of rebellious and psychedelic and, eventually got really wild. So, anyway, practice a little bit with, the guitar on your left leg just to change things up. Check out some of these songs and play around with some of these parts. And, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.